How should you apply EQ? Now in today's video, I want to talk to you about EQ, but more importantly, I want to talk to you about these. Now, I'm sure that the person who made these only has good intentions, right? But when I see an EQ cheat sheet that has the word questionable in it, I start to get concerned. I also know that from experience, when you're first starting out, you see a lot of these on Instagram, social media, stuff like that, and you just start blindly applying them to your work, right? Unfortunately, this can lead to a lot of bad habits and you mixing just by, following advice from Instagram and not necessarily doing what your music needs. Now, this isn't to say that these don't have any useful information in them, right? Like I do some of these moves quite often. But if you blindly apply these techniques without actually understanding their value, when and how to use them, you can actually end up doing a lot more harm to your music than good. Now, not only do cheat sheets encourage monotonous mixing practices where every kick gets the same EQ move and every bass gets the same EQ move, they also discourage mixers from using their ears to do the mixing. There is no part of mixing that should be automatic, especially when it comes to EQ. These sheets also encourage beginners to EQ in solo. Now, I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and say that I never EQ in solo, right? I do. A lot. But that's because I know how and when to do that. So let's say you're a beginner and you're using these sheets to mix your drums, right? So you solo your kick, you follow all the moves, you solo the snare, you follow all the moves. What you might not be realizing is that 4 out of 5 of these sheets are telling you to cut around 500 Hz and to boost between 2.5 and 5 kHz. So if you're mixing this way, you might end up getting really clean sounding drums individually, but when you go to sum them together, all of a sudden there's a giant hole in the mids and all that high-end energy is making them sound harsh. Now there's no glue, there's no cohesion, right? It sounds like there's 5 different drum samples happening and not one kit. But you did everything the sheets told you. Now therein lies the problem. You are mixing with your eyes and not your ears. So first things first, I can tell you that no professional mixer is sitting there with a sheet next to their computer and, they're not sitting there thinking, okay, this is a kick, so I have to cut below 50 Hertz, and this is a clap, so I have to cut around 500 Hertz, and this is a tom, so I have to do questionable things to it, right? They're using their ears to guide them. They're listening, they're analyzing, and then they're tailoring their treatment to what each track needs. Now, I'll admit, when you're first starting out, it can be very challenging to A, identify the problem areas in your mix, and B, learn to just leave some things alone. Now, I'm going to start out by talking about point B. When you're first starting out, it might be your inclination to put every plugin on every track. But let me show you a screenshot of a Waves tutorial where Tony Maserati is mixing drums. Did you catch it? Let me show you another screen grab where Leslie Brathwaite is mixing vocals for Lil Uzi Vert and Pharrell. Do you see it now? Look at the astonishing lack of plugins these engineers are using. These are Grammy winners here, and there's no more than 10 plugins visible in each one of these screenshots. Now, why is that? That's because they can hear that those tracks don't need any work. That brings me to my first tip when it comes to applying EQ. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you can't hear that something's bothering you, you shouldn't actively be trying to change it. You wouldn't take your car to the mechanic and say, "Can you fix it? Everything's working fine." No, what happens is you're driving down the highway, and you start to hear a little noise, and something's wrong, so let me bring it into the mechanic. Think about EQ like that. Try not to go there unless you hear that something's wrong. Tip number 2, try and fix the issue at the source rather than applying EQ. Imagine you're recording some vocals on an SM7. And to you, the vocals, they seem a bit boomy, a bit muddy. Your first inclination might be to throw an EQ on there and just kind of carve out some space in the low mids. Instead, try just having the vocalist take a half step back away from the microphone. What you might be hearing is just the proximity effect from how close they are to the actual microphone. So for instance, the diaphragm for this microphone is like 6 inches away from my mouth. But when I start coming in closer, even though I'm talking, quieter, you can hear my voice is getting much more boomy. Now, as I come back away from the microphone, it sounds more natural. Okay, so that's a little better. There's less low end, but now they seem a bit dull. Maybe you're recording a pop song and you need the vocals to really have that top end clarity on them to help them cut through the mix. Okay, so if you're a beginner, you might pull up your vocal cheat sheet and read that it tells you to boost around 5K to get that clarity. My first thought might be, what if we just use a different microphone? Let's go ahead and take a look at the frequency response for the SM7 versus the SM57. So we can see that the SM7 has a generally flat frequency response. However, the 57 has a built-in boost around 5K to get that clarity. So So it turns out you may not have needed to make that EQ move after all had you used a more appropriate microphone. Does this mean that now we don't have to do any EQ on the vocal? No, but now we're closer and we're more in the ballpark of what we wanted to hear in the first place. The better your recordings are, the less work you'll have to do on the mixing side. Tip number 3, EQ isn't always the answer. So here's a brand new mix session that I just prepped with a beat that I produced. Let me go ahead and play you a little bit. Alright, pretty basic beat, nothing too special there. But on first listen, my first thought was, man, that hi-hat needs to be just a little brighter, right? So again, as a beginner, your first thought might be to pop an EQ on there and make it brighter. Let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so not bad, but you know what else would have done the same thing? Just using the volume fader. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean. So I'm going to duplicate the track. Let's make this inactive. Now, how much did I boost that? About 4.5 dB. Let's go ahead and make this an even 4.5 dB. And now let me just raise the volume here by 4.5 dB. Now I'm going to flip back and forth so you can hear exactly how similar these two sound. You can't even really tell when I'm flipping back and forth. And this is because the fader is the most readily available EQ that you have. Think about it, right? What is an EQ really? Let's have a look. An EQ is really just a fader that allows you to raise or lower the volume of specific frequencies. So, in theory, a volume fader is just an EQ that operates across all frequencies evenly. And with the fader, I don't necessarily have to worry about things like phase shifting or coloration. It's just bringing everything up or everything down. Tip number 4, identify the problem areas before you apply EQ. As I said before, professional mixers are using their ears to guide them and to tell them what EQ moves to make. How can you learn to identify the problem areas as well as they can? Well, luckily, there are a number of terms that we all use collectively as engineers, artists, producers, etc. Now, you may have heard some of these before. Boomy, body, muddy, boxy, clarity, presence, air, right? These are all terms that we use to describe different areas on the frequency spectrum. I've made a diagram that roughly shows how I generally hear these terms. All right, so first up we have the boom region, right? The boom is going to be things like sub bass, things like the low end of a kick drum, stuff that's really going to add that low end hefty energy. Next we have the body. Now the body is things that you really feel in your chest, right? That's why I think about it as body. Things like a bass guitar, low end of a rhythm guitar, the body of a vocal, like the chest part of the vocal, the snare, that like the tone of a snare, things like that. So muddiness and body are kind of connected in my mind. When I hear something as being muddy, it sounds like there's a lack of clarity in the low end area. Next is this region I call the box. Now the box causes things to sound boxy. Now what do I mean by boxy? This region right here is what you hear when you put your hands over your mouth. So when I do this, you can hear like there's a lack of definition. There's a lack of definition. You can't really understand what I'm saying. It sounds boxy. The next region I generally think about as adding clarity, right? So this is the area that the human ear is really attuned to. This is like the upper harmonics of the human voice, of babies crying. Like this is what we evolved to hear. So if there's not enough like 2.5 to 5K in your vocal, it's going to be less clear. It's going to be less intelligible. If there's too much in this area, it can sound harsh. So if you hear someone saying that, this sounds harsh, it's generally around the 4K, 5K region. And again, that's because we evolved to hear this very clearly. So if there's anything more in that region than we're used to hearing, it can kind of throw us off our rocker and kind of sound grating and unnatural. Now next is the region that I call the air band. This band affects the overall brightness of your sound. So when I'm mixing a song, right, I'm listening and I'm trying to identify which of these regions needs help. I'm listening and analyzing and trying to figure out what I need to do before I try and do anything. Working in this way will help you accomplish 3 things. Number 1, it's going to make EQing a lot easier because now you have a set of goals you're going to try and follow. Number 2, it's going to help the EQ process move faster because now you're not going in blind trying to find the problem while making changes. Number 3, it's going to train your ears to identify problems more quickly. Over time, as you listen more intently and carefully, your ears will start becoming accustomed to what frequency bands you're adjusting. It'll almost become like muscle memory. You'll hear that there's too much body and instinctively go for 200. You'll hear that it's too bright and instinctively go for 12K. Now, of course, applying EQ is much more complicated than this, right? And we can dive into, linear phase EQing and coloration and things like that at a later time. But for those of you who are just starting out, this is a great way to conceptualize the idea of using EQ as a whole. Now, some of you might be asking, Brandon, you went into this saying not to trust EQ cheat sheets, and now you're giving us an EQ cheat sheet? Don't think about this as a cheat sheet, right? Because in reality, there is no cheating when it comes to mixing. This is just the best that I can visualize where these terms lie on the frequency spectrum in my brain. There is no magic frequency that you can cut or boost that's going to make your kick knock, or your bass slap, or your vocal shine. But there is an agreed upon system of terms that we all use as artists, producers, and engineers. So getting acquainted with them, learning what they sound like and where they are, is a great tool to add to your mixing tool belt. And what I like about this image is that these terms can be applied to any source, right? Whereas the other sheets were very instrument specific and very frequency specific. This sheet is just saying, does it sound boxy? This is kind of the area you want to look at. Does it sound boomy? This is the area you want to look at, right? Independent of whether it's a vocal, a kick, a snare, a bass, a tom, what have you. So now that you know generally where these areas are, let me dive in and go ahead and show you what these sound like on actual source material. So first, let me solo this vocal. It's from the Cymatics Euphoria pack, and you can hear it's a very well-recorded vocal. I wouldn't really want to do much to a vocal like this.
Tell me, babe, you wanna leave this town? I'm saying, love her if you wanna go, I'm down.
So it's very well recorded. Again, I wouldn't want to do much to a vocal like this. But let's go ahead and throw an EQ on there. And I'm just going to start exaggerating these different regions so you can hear what they sound like.
Let's go, love. I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
So there's not a lot of information in the boom region, except for on the word place. You can hear there's a little bit of a plosive. When he says place, it's like place. So let's go ahead and boost the boom region so we can exaggerate what that would sound like.
And ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Did you catch it? Whole place, right?
Leave this whole place behind.
Right, so that's in the boom region. So if you wanted to get rid of that, we can go ahead and notch it out.
Leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Or we can go ahead and filter it out.
Leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Now, I wouldn't actually do that. It actually sounds like a very natural P, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone. Next, let's examine the body region. I'm going to go ahead and play the same thing, and I will show you what it sounds like when I exaggerate the body region.
Let's go, love. I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Right, so you can hear that this is exaggerating the tone of his voice, right? Not the timbre, but the actual note, the fundamental harmonic that he's singing. And if I cut it away...
Let's go, love. I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Right, you lose the chest, right? You lose how close he is to you, and it just starts to sound thin. Let's move on to the box region, right? Now, in this recording, I can hear just a little bit of the room he was in when he recorded. Just a little bit. Let me go ahead and show you what I mean.
Let's go, love. I'm saying...
Let's go there. On that last you can hear just a little bit of the reverberation in the room.
Let's go, love. I'm saying...
You hear it, it's just a little tail.
Let's go, love. I'm saying...
But it also sounds in general like they might have been just a little bit too close to the microphone, or maybe they were in a corner or something. This region is actually bothering me just a little bit.
Let's go, I'm saying, ain't you tired?
Now, I found from experience that you don't necessarily need the first harmonic in a lead vocal. That might not be true in all instances, but in general, I've gotten away with cutting out the majority of the first harmonic. So if the fundamental was at 200 or 220, I can get away with cutting like around the first harmonic, so 440, without really doing too much damage to the vocal. So let me go ahead and just notch that out.
Let's go, I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
So you're starting to hear there's less room, and it's almost like he's just getting a little closer to the microphone, a little more intimate, right? Now let me do the opposite. Let me boost this region so you can hear what a really boxy vocal sounds like.
Let's go, I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Right? He's still intelligible. It just sounds weird. It sounds, let's go, I'm saying, let's be, right? It just doesn't sound natural.
Let's go.
Let's go. That's that area, right? Sounds like we're in the box. Next, let me demonstrate clarity, right? Again, this is the area that we evolved as humans to hear, right? So if this isn't clear, your vocal is going to be unintelligible. Let's go ahead and set this to 2500 and just start boosting.
Let's go, I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Right, so as I boost it, not much change. He just became a little bit clearer. Let me try an A/B so you can make it more obvious.
Let's go, I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting?
It might be more obvious on tired.
Ain't you tired? Ain't you tired?
So there it's warm.
Ain't you tired? Ain't you tired?
There it's more clear. Now with this vocal, that might be more of a taste thing, but this is just to demonstrate, where that region is. Now lastly, let's look at the air band, and I can show you exactly why I like to call this the air band. So in this region, what you're really hearing is the actual air from his mouth hitting the capsule. So if you want it to sound more airy, maybe putting on like a shelf with a very slow cue.
Ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah. Ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind.
Right, so he's taking a step forward, but in a different way. Right? So we boosted a little bit of the clarity region and a lot of that air. So now he's becoming more clear. He's breathing a bit more and he just feels more intimate. So on a vocal like this, I'd probably do a move similar to this, maybe not so drastic, maybe around like 5 there. And I would go back around 450. And I would just notch out that room tone.
Ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah. Let's go, love. I'm saying, ain't you tired?
There's like one little piece of air in here that I don't quite like. That.
Of waiting, we could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
So that's about all I would do to a vocal like this, I guess, on the front end. Things might have to change once I start doing compression, but let me just go ahead and A/B that so you guys can hear the moves I'm making.
Let's go, love. I'm saying, ain't you tired of waiting? We could leave this whole place behind, yeah.
Next, let's move on to the guitar. I'll play you a little bit so you can hear what the sample sounds like dry. Again, very well recorded. But let me go ahead and exaggerate some of these bands so you can hear what, doing these EQ moves sounds like. First, let's start off in the boom region, so around 50 hertz. Now, it sounds to me like there's a lot of that, like palm hitting the strings kind of thing that's being captured in the boom region. right? So there's not a ton of energy down there. But when he does hit the palm on the body of the guitar, that's what we're bringing out with the boom. So if we don't like that, we can easily cut it. Now let's go to the body region. And again, I think about this as the part of the instrument that's going to hit me in the chest. So if I boost too much, it has too much body. But if there's not enough, it sounds thin. Next, let's go to the box region. Again, kind of sounds like there's a cup thing happening, right? We're bringing out these weird, nasty harmonics, maybe a lot of the room tone. But if we cut too much, they'll sound hollow. Now let's go to the clarity region. I can hear that there's a lot of like the pick that he's using in the clarity region. So if I wanted the attack to be more clear, I can go ahead and boost this region. Or if I thought there was too much, I can cut it away. So using EQ, I can kind of affect the way that this guitar is perceived. Was it hammered down on, or was it like lightly strummed? Lastly, we have the air band, right? So here, there is a lot of air hitting the diaphragm, but there's also like the metal twang of like the B and the E strings, like that metallic ring, right? So if I wanted a nice, like shimmery guitar, I would boost this area. If I wanted to do something, I might bring out a little bit of that shimmeriness, right? Just a little bit of that. There's a couple of harmonics that are fighting over here. Yeah, these guys. Right, I wouldn't do much, doesn't need much. Now lastly, let me show you some complicated EQ moves on a drum kit. So these drums were actually recorded in someone's garage with like budget microphones. There was no engineer present. They placed all the microphones themselves. So a lot of the EQ moves that I'm doing are kind of like to compensate for that fact, right? This isn't like standard mixing EQ, trying to get things clear and pristine. This is me trying to like replicate how I would have recorded it. So let me go ahead and take all the plugins off, and then I'll turn them on so you can hear what I'm doing to these drums. So let's go ahead and dive in. Initially, on my first listen, I thought, how would I have recorded this differently? So kick drum, for instance, right? Let's go ahead and solo that. It's missing a lot of low end. It's not kind of fluffy. There's a lot of room in there. But first things first, I would have recorded with a little bit more compression to make it more even. You can see it's very, very dynamic performance, right? So I'm gonna go ahead and throw the compressor on there. So the compressor is already bringing out that low end that I'm kind of missing, and it's also making it more even. Next, let's go ahead and take a look at the EQ. So if I open that up, we can see that I added some boom, but when I compressed, it brought up this nasty harmonic from the snare. So let me go ahead and bypass that and show you what's being brought up with that compressor. Right, so I don't want my kick mic to be fighting with the snare, right? If that's where the body is in the snare, I want the snare track to have that body and not have any of it coming from the kick drum. So I just went ahead and notched it out. Lastly, it seems like the kick mic was maybe a little too far away from the kick drum, or maybe there's not a porthole on it. So it was just placed on the outside of the kick drum, and that's why we're getting a lot of this. Right, so there's a lot of cymbal, there's a lot of snare, but I can't exactly filter it all out because there's also the kick beater in there, right? If we listen closely, there's a lot of the kick drum beater in there, so I can't filter it out. So I'm just, kind of taming it just a little bit. All right, after that, we have a gate. Now the gate's gonna be doing a lot more EQ than the actual EQ. So I have the gate set to only trigger when kick drum frequencies are being played. Right, so I don't have to actually filter out all that information. I can just put a gate on the kick and only allow the kick energy to pass through. Now lastly, we have the decapitator. It's just to add some grittiness to it, Okay, so it's not perfect, but it's not bad. Let's go ahead and move on to the snare. Snare, it's a very similar thing. I would have tracked it with compression. Let's throw the compressor on there. Now there is that ringing harmonic, that doom, doom, doom. Listen closely. Now you can see, I went ahead and notched that right out. Let's unbypass this. Right, so we're not getting rid of it entirely, but when that notch is in, it sounds like the snare has more body. We're hearing a lot more of this frequency right here. And I did think that the snare needed more body in general, just did a little bit of boost there. And again, we're cutting these frequencies to get rid of that cymbal noise, the hi-hat, things like that. And then lastly, similar thing here, we're gonna put on this gate so we only get the snare energy. And then again, decapitator, I wanted that just some edge. All right, so if we listen to the kick and the snare together, they're gelling a lot more now than they were before. I feel like I'm missing the actual snares on the drum. And so I had to put some of that energy back. So I created this track that I call the Snare Sizzle, which is essentially just a pink noise generator with a gate that's side-chained to the snare and a decapitator. That's it. So if I make this pre-fader and solo the Snare Sizzle track, it's just white noise. But if I put the snare in, it actually sounds like the snare drum. And the great thing about this is that if you had the right gate, you can actually adjust how long and how rattly the snare is, right? All right, so that's the kind of treatment that I was doing on the kick and the snare. But why is there no, plugins on the overheads? These drums were recorded in someone's garage, right? There's nothing I can do to these drums to make it feel like they were recorded at, Sunset Sound. So what I'm really doing is using the overheads to kind of pump back in that sloppiness, that grittiness, that raw energy from the garage. So if I play you just the overheads, you can hear there's a lot of that room, that energy, that rawness, that grittiness still in those tracks. right? It's sloppy, it's weird. But if I add the spot mics, it's much more centered as a kit. Right, so on the drums, what I was really doing is kind of sound design, right? But once I get into the bus, that's where I do more of the tonal shaping across the terms I was describing before. So let me go ahead and turn these plugins on. These are just kind of like, these are still like tonally shaping. This is a compressor. This is just a Smile EQ. And this is like a Abbey Road vinyl plugin. But let me go into the EQ. I thought that the kit as a whole needed a bit more body, needed a bit more of that room tone back. There might have been a little harmonic here that I didn't like, and I needed a bit more air from the cymbals. Now this guy, I believe I was using to notch out the cymbal. Where's that cymbal? That one. Right, it sounds much more natural that way, and it doesn't sound like the microphone was just put in the wrong place. Let's go to the next EQ. So this I actually used to boost the hi-hat, the stereo image of the hi-hat on the left side. And also to tame the center hi-hat. And lastly, we have this Pro MB. Now the Pro MB is just taming the dynamics of certain hits. So every now and then he does a little roll on the hi-hat that just kind of stuck out to my ears, or a cymbal that kind of stuck out. So this is just really taming those elements. Right, so I used the MB, the multiband compressor, because it wasn't a consistent thing, right? It was only happening every now and then. So now it's only, lowering the level of those frequencies when they happen. So sometimes he got a little aggressive with the roll, sometimes he's, a little bit more timid. Now it's just a much more even performance. Now this brings me to tip number 5. Less is more. Now if you watch the way that this is working, notice how little I'm actually doing with this multiband compressor. Right, there's only a 1.5 dB difference. If I bypass it, listen to the difference it's actually making. Right, it's subtle, but it's audible. Right, you don't have to make these huge 3, 4, 5, 6 dB moves to get the results you're looking for. I often see beginners making like huge 6 dB cuts and boosts when really all they needed was like 2 or 3 dBs of difference. If you can't hear the difference you're making while you're making like a 2 or 3 dB move to headphones. You'll notice once I started doing actual EQing, I moved to headphones. This is because I can more accurately hear the changes that I'm making as opposed to hearing the changes that are happening as a result of it, being played in my room. If you're working in headphones and you still can't hear the difference, maybe try picking a different frequency and a different cue size. If you still can't hear the difference, make sure your EQ isn't in bypass. Now, to my point, if I bring up some of the EQs that I was using, you might notice that not many of the EQ moves go past 2 or 3 dBs. So if we take a look at the kick drum, right, the way I'm getting that boom is only adding, a dB and a half in the boom area. This one's pretty drastic, but that's because I'm getting rid of that harmonic. Same thing on the snare drum, right? If I solo the snare drum, all right, I'm adding what? Again, a 1.7 dB of body. This one's notching out another harmonic. This one got a little drastic because there's a lot more cymbal here. So now if I remove the plugins on the kick and snare again, hopefully now it becomes more obvious that you don't need to make big changes to get big results. I hope thinking about EQ this way can help make both mixing and producing much easier for you. It may seem like a longer way to work at first, having to sit there, listen, analyze, and then execute, but I can assure you that over time, your skills will improve and this will become much faster. I can guarantee you that the more you work this way, the easier it will become. It's like riding a bike, right? When you first try it, you're thinking very cautiously and carefully about moving each limb in time because you're afraid to fall. But after a few months, your body starts to retain that muscle memory. Your ears will do the same. So thank you all for watching. Hope you guys learned something. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you all next time.